And we're back. We're live. Ergonautic. We talk about things and stuff, about humans working together with technology. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which I stumbled into. First, a little Uncle Andrew story time. So circa, we'll say 2012-ish, I've been working on Puppet and DevOpsy things and some OpenStack things, and was consulting in organizations of various shapes and sizes, and got this thing in my head that, oh, like this could be better. Like we have this new way of working, we have this new tool, and we can do different things. There's all these other tools, Chef, and the rest of it. It's a very interesting time. And what I started noticing is you could give the same tools and the same instructions to organizations that looked very similar, but they would get drastically different outcomes based on effectively how they could incorporate those tools and that information to change their behavior. So there's a few versions of this, but that's not how we do things here. Tends to be a barrier to actually making progress. And around this time, I stumbled into a dissertation, and I was naively searching for it when we were trying to do this, and I couldn't figure out exactly which one it was, but I could go, if I had more time, I'd go find it. But this thing was talking about the dimension of organizational learning, or dimensions of a learning organization, in the context of, it was a Chinese healthcare, a couple different things. And so then I found these references in that paper to Watkins and Marsick and some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. And then I think it's somewhat overcomplicated for most of the conversations that the standard executive and enterprise want to have, because there's 7 dimensions. I mean, 7, like, where's my 3 bullet list? Like, where's my 2x2 matrix? So I think that it's a little bit difficult for certain things. But when I first found this, I fell in love with it as a way to try to get people to understand. And you can go back and look at, like, there is no talent shortage. Probably one of my favorite talks I ever gave. It's focused on the 7 dimensions of organizational learning and my gratuitous game theory. But for that, like, moving into what the actual topic is, the 7 dimensions of organizational learning, it's founded in this research that goes back to the 90s. A bunch of people, a bunch of papers. You can go do the search for yourself if you want. But I'm just going to introduce the 7 dimensions really, really quick. We can kind of talk about what each of them mean. And then I also think that the key to unlocking it is this, it's called the DLOQ, Dimensions of Learning Organization Questionnaire. So that is how Watkins and Marsick and all these papers I'm referencing were doing their research, is this survey. And there's 2 versions. There's the long version and the short version, but that doesn't matter. That's a deep rabbit hole. So the first dimension of the 7 dimensions of organizational learning is continuous learning. That is the ongoing process of acquiring and applying new knowledge and skills in an organization. So it's about the emphasis on and importance of lifelong learning for individuals within the organization, and this culture that makes investments in doing so. The second dimension that the DLOQ measures is inquiry and dialogue. And this is a measure of how open the communication and questioning is within the organization. One of the things that I think is really interesting in this is that the openness, for there to be inquiry and dialogue, it has to be open regardless of rank, and create this environment where it's safe to question assumptions and discuss mistakes without fear of retribution. Then you have the third dimension, which is team learning, which is slightly different than individual learning, but it's focusing on the ability of groups within an organization to learn collectively. It's about kind of the collaborative problem-solving, team building that you see. And if you've ever played competitive sports, there are team sports, you start to see how each individual has skills, but if they're not kind of put together in a way where everyone kind of knows their place as a team, it's just a different dynamic than any one person having the capability. The fourth is empowerment. I think all these are critical, but this is one that's interesting. In a lot of the organizations we see, that it's ensuring the employees have the authority, resources, and autonomy to make decisions that affect their work. So this is the idea that, that no one knows more about the work than the people who are doing that work, and that there should be some way to take initiative and apply new ideas to reconfiguring how that work gets done. Then the one that I think is hardest to explain and understand is called embedded systems. And it captures a few ideas. So it's these mechanisms for capturing and sharing knowledge across an organization. The naive thing is, like you have a wiki and you have a learning, whatever, like artifacts scattered around. But to me, it also represents some of these ideas from stuff like XP has this idea of a shared metaphor, or if you've ever worked in an organization that has, you develop your own jargon. Like you have this language where you have these semantically dense conversations about things that no one outside that organization would be able to have. I think embedded systems, or I believe it also starts to capture some of the stuff that we're trying to do with the platform engineering effort, where you're not just making this stuff available as information, but you're trying to make it easy to do the right thing and reinforce that behavior with the actual system. And then number 6, the 6th dimension is the system connection. And that is about the organization's awareness of itself and how it's connected, and how the work that I do is going to influence other people's work, and how the work that other people does is going to influence mine. And then there's also this notion of the connection to the external environment. So there's these like internal and external exchange of information, feedback loops that allow us to adapt to do the right thing in the context. And then last, but definitely not least, is the 7th dimension, is strategic leadership. And this is about leaders being able, willing to model the learning behaviors, being able to take that feedback from the environment, being able to participate in inquiry and dialogue without just kind of stamping on everything because they're the highest paid person in the room. So that's the 7 dimensions. Quick one run through. Took about 5 minutes. And I think it might be worth discussing anything we think is interesting about that. And then I want to dive into some of the examples I think are interesting and some takeaways from the questionnaire.
So I think this was a lot of information, right? And it's hard to digest when you listen to this. I think what we should do probably is discuss every single dimension. I actually kind of tempted to skip the first one, because the first one is sort of obvious. Like you should be inspired to learn. If you don't have learning as a value, you're probably not going to learn, right? Like it's just kind of inherent in the process.
If you don't have smart people building your software, you're not going to be good at software.
Yeah, that too. But also if you don't hold something as valuable, you're probably not going to be good at it, right? It just kind of obvious. But I think the other dimensions are way less obvious than that. So we can go into the second one, which is inquiry and dialogue, and kind of means that you want to create a safe environment for folks to talk about, ideas and assumptions and mistakes. And that obviously, I think very quickly.
Part of my challenge personally is I kind of feel like all of them are super obvious. And then when I read this, it's like, oh yeah, this is like everything about this is obvious and right. But to the point you're making, it is exceedingly difficult to find psychologically safe environments in some organizations.
So I think we talked about psychological safety a couple of times before, but obviously this point number 2, the dimension number 2 is here called inquiry and dialogue, but obviously links very well to psychological safety and kind of the absence of fear. But also the upsetting thing is okay, this might be obvious. And also if you talk to people, then a lot of people aspire to create psychological safety. But if you look at actual research, how many teams and organizations are actually psychologically safe? So the professed value here doesn't match the actual reality on the ground in a lot of places.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the other thing I'd say, just kind of referring back to some of the other conversations we've had recently, like in particular, inquiry and dialogue goes right along with what we were talking about last week, right? Defensive reasoning, productive reasoning. You know, Argyris is famous for his dialogue analysis to help people understand when they're being defensive. Like literally, productive inquiry is part of like how he thinks about solving those problems, right? So how do you ask productive questions and things like that? And then Shine is famous for his books on things like how to avoid helping people who haven't asked for help. So like how to stop inflicting advice on people as a way of producing positive, appropriate inquiry. So I think those authors who are writing around the same time as this, is happening, the survey we're talking about, are directly relevant to the type of stuff that Marsick was talking about.
When we were talking about Argyris last week, I made the comment that I felt like this is a bit of an oversimplified kind of binary version of some of the stuff that you see in the Watkins and Marsick stuff. So
that's right. Yeah.
Definitely similar themes. And I think that's a recurring theme for a lot of the stuff we've been reading and talking about here is the similar themes. Like people use slightly different words, but if you're talking about Deming or Akoff or any of these other people, we were talking about Goldratt this morning.
Or anybody talking about personal learning, right? Any research into personal learning environments is like basically showing the same insights, and it's all very connected. But it is an interesting thing because we know the right answers, but we do the wrong things, right? Like that's one of these, and I see this a lot in personal learning where like every new book I read about personal learning, basically maybe there is some confirmation bias. Maybe every now and again I come across a book that says something completely different. That maybe happens, but like a lot of this stuff is like over and over the same insights. Yet when you look at people actually living their lives in the real world, that's not what they do.
I think this is the gap between knowing what you need to do, where you're talking about learning or diet and exercise, and then actually doing it, right? Manifesting the change. And this is part of why when I talk about learning, and there's some rabbit holes that we don't need to go in too deep today, but to me, you didn't learn until you change your behavior, right? You can read all the self-help books in the universe, but if it doesn't manifest as a behavior change, all you really did was collect the trivia of all those different ideas, and you didn't manifest learning.
Yeah,
So
I mean, good.
Sorry, I like this phrase, like EQ skills require practice. So one of the mistakes we frequently make is we just think that like we read this book or we watched this talk or we read this article, and now that we understand that we should behave a certain way, we will behave a certain way. And that is almost impossible. And also, again, this pertains to everything in learning, but you need valid, accurate, timely feedback. And so like if you learn to reason defensively, because our society has taught you to reason defensively for 35 years, and you're trying to reason productively, and you don't have feedback from anybody telling you like you're actually doing good or bad at this, and you're distracted by your daily life, like how much of a chance do you have at succeeding at reforming the way you approach things?
So do we want to keep going down dimensions, or do we want to go more along this idea of safety and the need for that?
I think we should go down dimensions because it's like, these are different rabbit holes we can dive into.
Each dimension can be its own hour easily. So then the next dimension on the list is team learning.
But I have one comment about the first dimension, just because I think it's interesting. One of my favorite talks that I ever saw was by Catherine Kirk. And the talk was called Continuous Improvement, Hell on Earth. And so the point of the talk was roughly the problem with the term continuous. So like there's this weird thing where in fact learning, so like let's use like weightlifting or running or any sort of other form of exercise that requires physical change. Like you need to rest. You can't actually just lift weights all the time. And so there's this weird aspect to continuous, which I think is important for managers to get, which is, continuous needs to include a time for people to like absorb and process what they're doing. It's not just literally continuously doing the same thing over and over again. You need to give people time to like recalibrate, rethink, reimagine, and that type of stuff. So I think that it's just an interesting, it's in particular the continuous improvement, frame is often like, oh, you have to always be finding the next problem. You have to always be, trying to solve for it. And I think it's endemic in the lean literature and the lean community to like just be constantly driving that stuff. So it's just it's a little side comment of like, be thoughtful about what continuous means.
That's one of the reasons why I hate the word sprint, and then also why I use this metaphor many times. Is like there's no such thing as continuous delivery. It's quantums. There's like some smallest possible amount of delivery that gets delivered.
Yeah, with a refractory period, right? Anyway.
So then, team learning. What does that mean to you, or does that does it make sense to us if we talked about that? Not necessarily does it tell us what to do.
They have their own sort of read on team learning, right? Because you can read team learning and derive all sorts of definitions of it. But I think the way they define it is that you can learn collectively as a team and maybe potentially as an intersection of teams, so that like you can build on each other's insights productively.
Yeah, I also
I mean, I already made this in my preamble, but if you've ever played a team sport, then it's one thing to know what you could do, whatever sport doesn't actually matter, but you can do certain things. But if you don't know what your teammates can do and you don't know where they're going to be and how they're going to be, then you can't really be cohesive as a team, right? And you see this dynamic play out in a bunch of different scenarios where teams that have the best quote unquote players don't necessarily win the championship, right? And they're playing against a team that has role players that know their role. So there's kind of this dynamic where you build the team in such a way that everyone not only learned each of their skills, like the requisite capabilities to deliver whatever the outcome is to win the game, but they're also understanding how the work that they do helps that next person, and that person, like there's a bit of trust, right? Like you don't want to pass the ball to someone who you know is going to lose it, right? Or vice versa, right? So you gotta build up that knowledge, that connectedness that are each individuals, but it's a collective learning too.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference between a team of individual contributors and a team. Right. And I think you see in a lot of organizations, they'll say it's a team, you go look, and it's like a bunch of people with completely disparate skills who never actually work together. They're just working on a task list that happens to be a shared task list, but the tasks are clearly intended to be consumed not by the team, but by an individual on the team. And that is kind of like one extreme of in essence, you have in complexity theory, we'd say you have an aggregate as opposed to a complex. An aggregate is like a pile of sand is an aggregate. There's no like interaction between the sand that's making it be interesting. Sandcastle is a complex interaction between sand particles, right? So like there's this weird kind of intermediate there. But the other thing that I'm really interested in, at least from the original survey, that is something that I like to point out to people occasionally when I get on my rants, is this question that's in the team and learning one. In my organization, teams and groups have the freedom to adapt their goals as needed. So like you have to listen to that question carefully, because the question isn't do they have the ability to adapt to the goals. The question is, can they adapt the goals? So this is the difference between saying you have autonomy to do what you're told however you want to do it, as long as you're doing what you're told, versus, Like you're doing work and I've given you a goal and you've figured out that goal isn't appropriate, and you have the autonomy to like refine the goal itself, to
So I think
change.
it's actually
You're
the next
skipping
dimension.
ahead.
Yeah,
Go
this
ahead.
is the next dimension.
Team learning and collaboration, question 7.
No,
So empowerment.
we'll come back to the questionnaire, but empowerment as the next dimension is related to both the.
Sure.
So I think, one of the problems with language is people think that words mean a certain thing. So it's valuable to have definitions in the context. So this empowerment in the context of 7 dimensions of organizational or learning organization is related to what you were just saying, right? So
Yep.
Employees have authority, resources, and autonomy to make decisions that affect their work. If you made a bunch of changes to how you work and you didn't have the reset about some of the goals, then maybe there's going to be some mismatched expectations.
Yep.
Potentially.
So I just say
So
my general point ends up being like when you talk about autonomy, or what I would prefer people talk about agency, it's a whole other rant. But it's like, do you have autonomy or agency over your process, your goals, and your outcomes? Like, are there actual ways that you can modify those things? Or is your autonomy highly constrained by someone else setting the goals, someone else setting the process? In which case, like, your autonomy is quite limited. It's not maybe even like lip servicey and not real autonomy at all. Anyway.
Yeah, it's the engineered choices that potentially force you into the correct quote unquote action or whatever. But I do think that this is a very valid point, that the question there that says teams have the freedom to adapt their goals as needed is way more agency than most organizations give their people. So like typical micromanagement is you would have no agency, not just for the goal, but also how you accomplish the goal.
Yep.
Then like much better is you give me the target and I figure out how to get there. But
Yep.
if you are giving me the agency to adopt the target, is potentially like the highest degree of freedom, but
Yep.
it's also potentially what you want, because the person on the ground, as we've talked about many times, is the person who knows how work gets done and what problems they face.
Yep. And so I think like one of the reasons I like to dig into this a little bit is the way in which we have talked about organizational learning or team learning as being the rewiring of the connections between individuals, so that there's actually learning in the way that your brain learns by rewiring neurons. The rewiring of the way that the team interacts within itself and with its environment is a form of learning that is greater than any of the individuals, right? If you are robbed of the ability to change your interactions with the external world, your goals, for instance, and you're also robbed of the ability to describe your roles and interactions between roles, or you're limited to certain processes, by definition, your team can't learn, only the individuals in the team can learn, right? Because the team itself can't restructure itself. It can't adopt new forms. It can't have new pathways of communications evolve based on the context that it's in, right? So I think that's just it's just an interesting and potentially controversial.
The neuron can fire faster, but it can't connect to anything else.
That's right. You only get to talk to your 3 neighbors that you've been talking to since birth. Anyway, keep going. Sorry, Sasha.
Right. So the other thing, and this is a quote from one of the review papers that's also related to this research, right? But basically, it breaks down that organizational learning has 2 dimensions. One is individual learning for individuals inside the organization, and the other is organizational learning that adapts the organization to the environment. Yep. And both of these kinds of learning can be actively encouraged or discouraged by the organization, and the outcomes will be different. And I would say that in most cases, when one of the outcomes is encouraged, the other one is too. So like they kind of go hand in hand. In more generative cultures, you will have both types of learning, and in more pathological cultures, you will have neither.
Yep. And I just like, again, it's a last, at least my last thing on this right now, is you can see some of this occurring in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, where, for instance, Microsoft starts really thinking about their evaluation process and saying, oh, evaluating individuals is destroying team cohesion. because it's creating unnecessary competition between the individuals. It's not, and you get a lot of this in lean and agile where people should be evaluated as a team, not as an individual, all this kind of stuff, right? You can see these themes coming out, but no one is like trying to explain what it would mean for the team to learn as opposed to individuals learning. It's still all these, questions about, are you doing the process correctly? Maybe the reason why your Scrum isn't working is because you're not doing it by the book. It's like,
You're not scrumming hard enough.
Right, exactly. And you get these, the baseball metaphors where it's like, stop saying you're playing baseball if you're not actually playing by the rules. It's like, who said they wanted to play baseball? They're just trying to play a game. Let them evolve the game so that it works in their context. Anyway.
So I think this is the hardest one to grok when you first introduce these ideas. The dimension of embedded systems and the existence of the structures and policies and procedures that help support learning and communication.
So why do you think this is the hardest one?
I don't think it's the hardest one to understand. I just think that the language, the wording, like in some ways it's actually better that it's not clear. So I think there's a opposite problem with some of the other ones that people hear the words and they think, oh, I know what that means. And so they presume like this is what it means in this context. So it's worth explaining. But embedded system, if you just said embedded system to someone, I think that doesn't trigger some understanding for most conversations. You kind of have to explain a bit more.
The operational definitions are not clear. So, the stuff they have here is basically mechanisms, and they don't actually, mechanisms and systems for sharing knowledge, right? And I have never been in an organization that did it extremely well. Like it's always very, very difficult. I am wondering if actually Gen AI can help us with that. And that's because part of the problem with sharing knowledge is the knowledge gets out of date quicker than code does. Like it's just like awful. It's awful in terms of how quickly it loses its updatedness. I don't know. I need an adjective.
It's like the half-life of information, right? So
right, and then the other thing is like everything is contextual, right? So if you're reading a Wikipedia page and you're not in the same context as the person who wrote it, like are you gonna be able to make sense of it, right? So and then there's on top of it, there's like how difficult these systems are to manage and how difficult it is to find time to actually store information and all of that stuff. So this is why I'm actually saying like potentially Gen AI can help us here because it makes it easier to retrieve information. It potentially makes it easier to store information. Yes, it maybe creates some problems with accuracy of information, but I think largely it can improve our experience with knowledge sharing.
So this is another deep rabbit hole, probably deserves its own hour too. But one of the things that I think is interesting to explore in that particular comment about generative AI is that the questions that people are asking is interesting data, right? So if you're trying to build this learning loop and you've built whatever, you know what questions were asked and you know what the response was. So if it's inaccurate or whatever, you can maybe correct it after the fact, but it's not necessarily worse than having people wait around, right? So there's always this tension between availability and consistency. Like, are they getting the right answer? Are they getting work done? But the fact that anyone asked that question is information about the org and what people know. This is a deep rabbit hole, but for me, the embedded system question is really about kind of like what defines our tribal capabilities and how we share the tools. Like there's this notion of common ground that we talk about in a bunch of our stuff. If you don't have these embedded systems and everyone has to kind of be brought along from first principles about how we do work here, then you're never going to be as productive as you can. So this kind of like reinforcing structural, procedural, and tools that are all part of this kind of how we do things here. Yeah, all the rest of them help you evolve that. But if you don't really have that, you're never going to be able to compete against organizations that have that. And I wouldn't say I've been somewhere, some larger organizations that does this particularly well, but certainly in certain phases of startups or kind of smaller to medium companies, you do get this feeling. And I made this argument before that, like, when you feel like you're on a team, like if you're not feeling that, you long for that feeling. Like, oh, we're part of this thing. We're all trying to do this work. If you don't have that, you want it. Once you've experienced it.
I think that, so the other thing that I think they kind of emphasize, or an example of what they emphasize in embedded systems would be like Coburn's idea of information radiators and things like this. So like, what kind of systems do you need to build to make the state of the system clear to people who are interacting with that system, right?
1000%.
So in our kind of way of thinking about it, like when we talk about things like ergonautics versus ergometrics, we believe you need to build an effective work system, but we also believe you need to build an effective way of helping the people in that system be able to see the system itself, right? That's a critical aspect.
Observability of the socio-technical system.
That's right. And so like I have a example that I tend to bring out on this one, which is if you've ever worked in a place where there's like managers who get monthly reports, and they read down the reports and there's all these statistics about what happened over the last month. And then those people come out and onto some floor and berate people for missing some month-long target or something like that. How is it that those people were supposed to know that they were missing that target until the end of the month? Aren't there probably signals in the system prior to that happening where they could have steered the system prior to the manager coming out and being like, you guys didn't do the right thing? So building systems that allow the manager not just to say we missed, but we're in process of missing. We're going to miss, right?
The error budget.
Yep. And so you end.
Just to move.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. I just want to get to the questionnaire. So
absolutely,
let's talk about the last two really quick. So system connection is a measure of how. I actually think it largely connects to what we were just talking about with metrics, or at least partially, because there's narratives and some other things that connect us. But if you don't have insight into the upstream and downstream impact of the flow of work, then it's hard for you to optimize for your work as well.
So I think the system connection talks about external environment, or
it's both.
Yeah. But it's got like the first one, right? Is my organization encourages people to think from a global perspective. Right. So again, this is this idea that like without a overarching shared goal for the organization, individuals in meritocracies who are rewarded for doing the best work that they can do will optimize their part of the system to be optimal to prove that they're doing the best on that part of the system. And
they will win the game that you gave them to play.
And if you haven't thought about whether or not the best muffler in the world connects to the best engine in the world, you get no car, right? You going out and selecting the best component from every car on the planet and putting it in a room does not give you the best performing car in the room, right? You actually have to get the parts to work together. And that is not something you can do in abstraction by evaluating the individual parts individually. You have to have some sort of global perspective. And so, again,
I like that visual.
Yeah. So again, if you don't have that, or if the only people who have the global perspective are some sort of executives who've never clearly explained that global perspective to the people inside, you're getting towards that thing that we talked about earlier, which is, I know what the global thing is supposed to be, so I need to control the way you interact. I need to control your processes in order to make sure that the global thing gets satisfied, because I don't trust you to do it for yourself. Instead of saying, oh, I'm going to share the global perspective with you. I'm going to help you understand what we're trying to achieve. And then I'm going to trust you to optimize your relationship with the people around you. Totally different conversation. And by the way, I think it means that managers move from being controlling to teaching people how to negotiate with people who they don't agree with. That's the biggest like connective tissue problem in most organizations is the managers think when there's a problem between two parts of the system, the muffler doesn't fit with the engine, it's their job to go yell at both sides and make them work together, as opposed to saying the muffler team needs to talk to the engine team directly and negotiate how these things work together.
So connecting that to the last one, I feel like this almost has the opposite of what I talked about with embedded systems, where people hear these two words and think that they know what they mean. So the seventh dimension being strategic leadership. And I think this is another one of these things where this one especially is easier said than done based on observation, but it's really about someone having the position to be a leader and do the right thing to make the rest of this stuff happen. But it's easy to say strategic leadership, and
so what
what you
here
often find is a bunch of plans and assertions about how we're going to do this.
So what I like here in this in their definition is the word model, right? Because when you say strategic leadership, people think that the leader has to come up with the best ideas and then have the most convincing arguments to convince people to follow the ideas. But in reality, what they're talking here is modeling learning behaviors, which means being okay with vulnerability, being okay with discussing your mistakes, being okay with, failing in some context. So, it is difficult in particular. So first of all, because sometimes we're socialized to believe that these behaviors are incorrect. So therefore leaders must be infallible. And also because somewhat it is true. So leaders are expected to demonstrate proficiency and confidence and, give people this sense of stability and safety, especially in difficult situations.
The psychological safety rots from the head, I think is the way.
Exactly right. The dead fish of psychological safety.
So this is in a way a paradox, right? So on one hand, you're supposed to, as a leader, you're supposed to show people that confidence and I know where we're going, everything is going to be fine, just follow me, it will be okay. And on the other hand, you're supposed to be able to say, like, I screwed up, and if I can screw up and nothing catastrophic happens, then so can you.
So I think like one of the other things that I get from this is actually in contrast to the last one. So I think the problem with a lot of executives is they misunderstand what strategy is altogether. So the previous point was about managing the organization as a system. So executives in particular are kind of responsible for managing the system. So literally managing how the interactions work, trying to figure out, and managing might mean delegating or mentoring and all sorts of other things about how the system works. But sometimes I compare that to being like, if you want a basketball team, if you're the owner, you're responsible for like making sure the right players are available, making sure there's a stadium and there's vendors and there's people in the seats. Like you manage the system that the game occurs in, right? Strategy, especially the way they describe strategy here, is how you manage the system performing something, doing something, right? Trying to achieve a particular goal. It's action oriented as opposed to systems oriented. And so I think getting people to understand that there's these two separate things. One is how the system is, how it interacts, what capabilities it has, etc. And another one is how it's being applied and whether that application is working correctly. Strategy is that second thing. Strategy has to do with action, has to do with being active and whether those actions are playing out correctly. And they're completely different management exercises in my mind.
So let's transition to talking about the questionnaire. And we've already read a few questions, but I want to just explain the mechanism a little bit and then read a few questions and then kind of get into, like, there's a bunch of great things that I think are insightful just to go through the questions, but we don't have time for all of them. So the idea here is that you're taking a survey as an employee of an organization, and that you're given these questions, and you see a few different versions floating around, like from 1 to 10. There's the long form has 43 questions, the short form has 21 questions, whatever. But this is representative. So you're asked this question. The first question, and they're grouped by individual, team level, whatever. Jay Barry skipped to the end for some of it, but the first question on this is, in my organization, people help each other learn. So the idea for the research, the exercise back in the 90s is you answer that question from almost never to almost always. And then the second question is, people are given time to support learning. Almost never, almost always. In my organization, people are rewarded for learning. Almost never, almost always. And on and on and on. So the thing that I think is interesting, one is the analysis that they built up about why this set of questions is representative to map onto the 7 dimensions is interesting, like science. But then for me, and this may or may not be as obvious to other people, and maybe I'm just a crazy person, but to me, if you invert this and instead of making these questions, make them statements, then it gives you the path to everything that you need to be a learning organization, right? So if in my organization, people help each other learn is a statement and not a question, then that's a powerful statement. In my organization, people are given time to support learning. That's not a question, that's a statement. So I feel like the way to make the dimensions of organizational learning actionable is go through the list of the questions and make them true.
Or so make them true is good, right? But like remember the games people to play, right? Incentivize the behavior you want to see.
Hate the player, not the game. Just kidding. So what you already pointed out a few, but like read another 1 or 2 of these that stand out to you, and that's the royal you. So if you pick one, we've already heard a couple, but I think they're all interesting, right? So here's my organization recognizes people for taking initiative. Almost always, almost never. Right? If that was true in your organization, then how many more people would take initiative?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me again of the sorry, not the dimensions, but the organizational cultures, the Westrum. Do you kill the messenger? Do you discourage the messenger, or do you encourage the messenger?
Absolutely.
I encourage the messenger only if the messenger has good news.
I think that's a little toxic, maybe.
Toxic.
Yeah, another thing I would tend to think of there is so it's an example of why the questionnaire is probably a system in itself. It's not a list of individual things, because if that was one of the only qualities you had on the list, lots of people taking initiative would just create chaos.
Absolutely.
Right? So you need the organization to be able to absorb and challenge and interact with the initiatives people are taking. And you also need those people who are taking initiative to be able to take feedback and understand how to integrate that feedback.
So a few questions above the initiative one is, my organization creates systems to measure gaps between current and expected performance. If that's a true statement, then a lot of what we were talking about is gone.
I agree. Yep.
Or easy, depending on how you want to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you have clarity around those things, and that the gap, so just based on my own research, it depends on how big that gap is. If you make the gap too big, people don't have any way of reasonably crossing the gap with their own work. So you have to figure out how to structure the gaps across the organization in ways that allows them to have agency, right?
If the gap between current and expected performance is too wide, you have terrible leadership.
That's correct. Yep. You're not breaking down the issue into things that are kind of appropriate for the context that the people are working in, right? And it's kind of like it's the same thing as not giving them other kind of resources, not giving them a challenge that is something that they could actually potentially solve for themselves is the same thing as not giving them money or, you know, the right people or the right servers. They're missing a critical component of being able to act independently and learn.
So here's another fun one. I think it has some interesting implications with respect to market dynamics and open source communities. My organization works together with the outside community to meet mutual needs. As a statement.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I mean, it's sometimes when we talk to people, we talk about how like DevOps days was originally kind of thought of as being a way of saying you have like an internal DevOps culture experience or something like that. But eventually, inside of your own little I don't want to say bubble, but your own context, you'll run into problems where there's nobody in the room who necessarily has seen that before. And so you have this global culture, which is more generalized, potentially more abstract generally, but you can go out into that community, hear people saying things that sound somewhat like the problem that you're trying to solve, and then go and sit in something like an open space and say, I'm having that problem too. And so that's like a relationship where you're enriching the global environment and the global environment's enriching your internal environment through effective dialogue and inquiry, right?
Or sometimes even better, you get a nice discussion, maybe debate about how we solve that problem 3 different ways in 4 different organizations.
Yeah, super enriching, right? Like help you see it from a bunch of different perspectives and also give you the idea that you can't just cargo cult in something from Google.
I mean, you can, but
then you have wooden airplanes that don't actually take off. But anyway.
So 21 relates to some of the other themes about the values and stated, the gap between stated and actual. But in my organization, leaders ensure that the organization's actions are consistent with its values.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a super challenging one. I like, again, from like Argyris.
But what if that was true, Jay?
That'd be great. Yeah, I think the trick for somebody like Argyris would say there's like such a difference between espoused values and performed values, right? Like people say all the time, like we value work-life balance, but then you go in there and you're like, does everybody really actually have work-life balance, or is this just something you're saying?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And we were talking about this earlier, right? When we like, everyone claims to want to learn, right? Not everyone learns. And it's not that they're lying to you. They're lying primarily to themselves, right? But the unfortunate consequence is that you don't always get the outcomes you want.
Yeah, I think that there's can also be this like face-saving activity, which is like someone on high says over the next 2 quarters, we're going to really emphasize organizational learning. And that rolls down into like a bunch of OKR nonsense that eventually everybody has some sort of like subtask that they're supposed to be doing in relationship to organizational learning. And at some point, like the middle manager basically says, listen, here's the way this is going to work. If you guys tell everybody that we're not actually doing these tasks, then they're going to come and make us do these tasks, and you're going to disempower me, so I won't be able to defend you in the future. On the other hand, if we all just pretend like we're doing organizational learning for the next couple months, this initiative will be over and we won't have to talk about it anymore.
Well, there's another thing, which is like you measure what is easy to measure. So
Sure.
I gave people a learning budget and a learning time. And what I wanted to see is that they went to a conference and they spent the learning budget. Like, you're looking for the keys under the light.
Yep. Agreed.
So this is the kind of thing that makes me want to have convulsions, but it's this process wonkery where people are focused on the adherence to the process. There's not an organizational learning process. That's not what we're talking about.
Yep.
It's about activating the individual neurons in such a way that they align with this collective capacity, this adaptive capacity this resilience, all the words everyone hopes to have. It's not about, oh, we implemented organizational learning as a project. It is a thing that continues.
Continuous learning, your personal hell.
Not to confuse it with continuous and the problems that Jabe was pointing out earlier, but it's that it goes into infinity.
Yep.
That's an interesting, like, I mean, I gave the learning talk at some conference, and one of the most surprising comments I had from someone who liked the talk, they were like, well, you're implying that I have to do this all the time. When do I arrive? Like, I should arrive. And I'm like,
nope.
Wait, but it's an interesting thing. Like, is there, like, should you arrive? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't want to arrive. Like, because their example was like, well, what if I'm retired? I'm like, well, that doesn't mean you can want to stop learning. Like, at least not for me, but.
So there's arriving, and then there's the game that you want to play and the game that you want to win, right? So as an individual, I mean, this is other crossing the streams a little bit with some of the language learning stuff, but you're only going to learn to the level of your necessity, right? And so this idea that you have to constantly be changing everything, grind culture, whatever, like that's interesting to me personally sometimes, but it's exhausting, as Jay pointed out. And it's really about, at what level do you have to participate, right? Do you want to win? You want to be the world champion for the marathon or the 100 meters? Like, those are two different things. And both of those are hard, right? So, but not everyone needs that, right?
I want to point out, when you say you only learn to the level of your necessity, what is important to specify is the necessity is usually internally driven. It's not externally driven. It can be, but most of the time. So, like, I can learn a language not because I practically need a language, but because something inside me told me that I will be better off for learning the language. It practically might not have any value to me, but I have a necessity.
I don't want to go through the whole hierarchy of needs here, but it's like, I feel like that starts to be more true as you get the lower needs met, right? So if you cannot eat, and the only way you can get food is to utter things in some foreign language that you don't know, like, you're going to make it work. You're going to find, you're going to make progress really fast. As you get to where most of your needs are met, then what you said becomes 1,000% true. Like, you have to constantly, like, press yourself into, do I want to have conversations about this thing? But bringing it back to this organizational context, the external reality changes. So I think, maybe we, like, get too close to dipping into Kinevin or some of this other stuff here. But if you're in a mode where you've sort of been winning as an organization, or winning enough that your business has been there and healthy for a long time, and then the external market changes, then what are you going to do? What are you going to be? Right. So there's a bunch of stories in history. There's a bunch of stories we're probably seeing play out in time. But, what did Toyota start its life as? What did Honda? I'm for some reason, I'm pulling all these Japanese companies, like Nintendo, right? Like, there's these interesting, like, rebirths that happen as organizations reinvent themselves, and they only could do that if they had some adaptive capacity to learn and respond.
Yep. I had, like, two thoughts on this. The first one is that, like, one of the issues with kind of trying to, like, measure and think through things that have big highfalutin value, like learning organizations, is it's hard to kind of, like, for most organizations, I think it would be hard if you said, okay, so you want to do some learning organization stuff, and they'd say, yeah. And you'd say, well, why do you want to do that? And they'd be like, well, it's obvious. We just want to be a learning organization. That's just an inherent good. It's good to be a learning organization. It's like, well, I'm not disagreeing with you that it is a good thing. I'm just saying, like, what is your expected outcome? And because they can't have that kind of difficult conversation, like, what are the outcomes? Like, what do you expect to actually happen if you're learning better? You get this kind of regressive measurement of, like, well, we'll know we're doing well because people will go to more classes, or people will use the learning management system to take more courses, or whatever. All things that have nothing to do with a valuable outcome for the company itself. Those are like indirect measurements of something happening, but they're not the outcome based version that you might want. And this is related to a secondary thing, which is like all strategies at these bigger levels. Part of the biggest problem with them is that they don't really ever have a stopping point, an ending point. They're often asymptotic. Like, can you ever be a perfect learning organization? No, you can't be. You can only try to continuously be a better learning organization, right? So that means like, well, does everybody just dedicate 100% of their time all the time to a learning organization? And it's like, well, I don't know. Is the only problem your organization have is learning, or are there other problems? So it's like a dynamic balance, right? Like, oh, well, we need to focus on improving our learning, and that's going to highlight other problems that we have, which means we'll kind of roll out of learning a little bit, and it'll go back and forth. You will never stop this learning process. You'll just emphasize other things occasionally.
So part of this, I want to drag out the fifth discipline,
yeah,
or your like Sanghi stuff, and like this separation between the domain of action and this kind of domain of change. And a lot of what we're talking about when you're talking about organizational learning is pulling you into that domain of change. But if it's not reflected, like there's a pathology to any extreme, in my opinion. And if all you're doing is navel gazing about how you could learn and how you could do this, but you don't bring it back into the action, then it's like the person who read every single self-help book and didn't change anything about their diet.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. Why do you want to change your diet? Well, do you want to lose weight, or do you want to be healthier? Do you want to run a marathon? Whatever. Like, what are the actual outcomes?
What games you need to win, right? Like, I feel like unbounded, nebulous learning is bad.
Yep.
Maybe like you get into pathological states really fast, but if you say, we want to be better at this, I want to accomplish this, and you kind of set the smart goals, time-bounded goals against that learning background, that's when you get the best outcomes.
Yeah, and like just as Andrew will make fun of me for using the particular version of it that or the particular thing that I use, but I'm going to use it because it's kind of popular and well known. It's kind of like saying I want to learn the Queen's Gambit. It's like you can't learn just the Queen's Gambit. The Queen's Gambit leads into other branches. You have to kind of actually know what the other possibilities after the Queen's Gambit are, right? Like it's only a way of starting to shape a game. It's not the game. You can't win with the Queen's Gambit. You have to go beyond the Queen's Gambit, right?
I mean, it gives you the first three moves, but you're not like, you still have an end game or a middle game to get through. So.
Right, and all you're doing when you're picking a gambit like that is trying to limit the initial branching of the game, so you have a better idea what's likely to happen. But that's it. That's all you get from it. You don't win just because you play the Queen's Gambit, for instance. And I think actually very few people win.
That works for me, though.
Huh?
If I'm 4 years old, that works for me. It's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I love me some chess metaphors, but I think this is where you quickly get into it depends, right? A lot of times when people are trying to do whatever transformation, agile, DevOps stuff, they kind of want this list of what the move should be, but it's, you didn't look at the chessboard yet. Like, how do you know what the move should be if you didn't see how the pieces are set up on the board?
Yep. And also,
we're
I
not
tried
at time. So
we
what's
do have
our empowering
meetings,
message?
but I want to talk about chess. Anyway,
right. What is our empowering message to our listeners and readers around the globe?
My message is that everyone should take 10 minutes to read through the DLOQ, which you can find by searching for DLOQ, and try to make those questions into statements. I think that's
a bit more organized. We might even put it in show notes.
We can still do that.
I think my message would be that the DLQ, I'm dyslexic. The random letters that make up the name of the survey are equally about measuring teams, individuals, and leadership. right? Like if you think as a leader that the goal of the DLQ is to like send it out for other people to do, and you don't have to think about it except for the results, and it doesn't apply to you, then you're missing half the game. It's just as much about you reflecting on, am I enabling these types of behaviors, or am I restricting them or making it difficult to do them?
You're literally disregarding the leadership, strategic leadership dimension.
Absolutely.
So
important.
connected to that, my empowering message is like write it down. EQ skills require practice, and practice requires feedback. You have to practice. Like if you want to be better at something, or you want your organization to be better at something, you need to practice the skills that you want to execute.
Someday I'm going to convince Sasha to replace the word practice with praxis.
With a team.
Maybe with a team and a language expert, right?
You need access to expertise. That is definitely true to make
theory-informed practice. That's where it's all at.
It's fun to make it up as you go, but sometimes it's faster to take advantage of what someone else already learned. So with that, we'll move on to our
meetings,
our day. Thanks for visiting. Till next time.